I don't know whether you've seen this, but, well, I mean, we know that there's a Hollywood writers' strike and actors' strike at the moment. And so because of that, all of the late shows aren't running because they don't have any writers, because they're not funny without having a team of 30 people write jokes for them. And still not all that funny. But they've all band together. So we got there's 5 late night hosts: Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, and Seth Meyers. I did have to read those out because I don't actually really know most of the names, not off by heart anyway. Not overly excited about those guys. But they're doing a podcast. You're not being able to do their shows, their late night shows. They're getting desperate, and they're like, well, we need to put out some content. And I'm sure that their bosses are, with them paying them millions and millions and millions of dollars each year, trying to get them to do something. So why not just do a podcast? So there's a link below where Stephen Crowder actually responds to this, and that's what you're seeing right now. He's responding to the absurdity of these 5 and the ad that they put out, the sizzle reel or the promo of this. Dr. Rod, 5 late night hosts doing a podcast, and as you can see from this footage, literally in their bedrooms and just in like, come on, they're earning millions of dollars. Can't they do it? I don't have a big budget, and I've at least got a decent background here. And Dr. Rod's like, well, you had your fancy black background that we had the last few weeks, but you decided that you want a little bit of life, a little bit of warmth behind you, and at least that's a nice background. These guys are on millions and millions of dollars a year. I don't get it. Is this desperation?
Well, I've got no doubt it's desperation. But my immediate reaction was, well, good on you for having a go, because what's happening, of course, is that late night TV shows are not really being watched by as many people now as was the case. So the audience have tended to fall, particularly among younger people. Yep. And there are lots of people now doing podcasts that have, in fact, got more people watching than have the late night shows. Although it's a little bit difficult to make comparisons because the data are not quite comparable. But, Crowder himself gets something like 3 million viewers. Not that they necessarily stay for the whole of his show, but he's doing very well. Yep. I take your comment about the backgrounds not being very professional. Now, we don't know what it will look like with the full podcast. But, I think good on him for having a go. But just the teaser there wasn't enough to make me want to watch, put it that way. It wasn't all that professional. But I think, maybe this highlights the fact that they rely so heavily on their writers for material that these people are not necessarily funny people at all.
Yes.
They just happen to have a few writers who can actually produce a bit of comedy. They're actors.
Yes.
Reading their lines, and maybe people will become more aware of that now as a result of the writers' strike. I just don't think this is going to do much good for their careers, and maybe as desperate leaders, they might have thought of something else. Look, I don't. I'm not critical of them for giving it a go at all.
Yeah.
But like you, I think they'd probably have to do something a bit more than they appear. Look, it looks as if they're just going to talk with each other for an hour or so. That's what they said, for an hour or so.
What am I going to have an hour or so?
Well, I don't know. Who's going to watch it? I just don't know. And I don't know what their studios will think in terms of whether or not they're in breach of their contracts and so on. It's interesting, but in a nutshell, good on them for giving it a go. But maybe they need to talk to a few professionals first so they get a few things right.
Well, actually, it's interesting that you say speak to a few professionals. But the thing is actually the podcast world is full of people that are doing the podcast are not professionals. That's kind of like the ones on TV are the professionals, and the ones doing podcasts are just backyard or
Well,
garage,
a lot
kings,
are, Craig, but the ones with the big audiences, we've talked about this, in earlier podcasts. A lot of those who've got the really big audiences, they do have a good studio set up.
100%.
Sure, you see their microphones a lot of the time, but they do have a good setup. And as we've noted before, many of the best are former comedians, or they're still comedians.
Yes.
And they took to podcasting partly as a result of the COVID lockdowns and so on. And some of them now, like Crowder, they have very large audiences. There are others. I mean, we talked about Brett Cooper a little earlier. She's absolutely amazing. Like, she's incredible. I would say she's highly professional. Yep.
No,
the studio. You know what I mean?
I agree with you. I was kind of having a dig. I believe, like 100%. I believe that the podcasting world they're professionals, but it's kind of like it's interesting that the podcasting world was kind of the underdog, the person setting up their studio in their own home.
Sure, it's kind of
against the studios.
Democracy it's democracy in broadcasting, really, because anybody can have a go. And you're right.
Yep.
All you need is a smartphone. That'll get you going. A smartphone stuck on a stick somewhere, and that's enough to get you going. But it probably isn't enough to win you a large audience.
No. I just look. You mentioned about the studios. I reckon the studios are actually probably put them up to put these guys up to it, because they're like, you guys aren't working. You guys need to go out and create some content and stuff like that. Going back to our previous story, when you're desperate, like they've got no work, they're not allowed to work, or they can't work without writers. They're getting desperate. What do? You look at what resources, what skill set you have. Okay, let's do a podcast. That's like the next stage. But I think what you mentioned was it will expose, and I think that's what happens in desperate times. Desperate times really expose your character. It exposes your skill set, your ability, because during good times, there's a lot of leaders that coast by on just the fact that it's good times, or just because there's heaps of funding at the moment, or maybe coasting off their team, like we're talking about with the writers. And so you have, in good times, bad leaders can hide in good times. But when things get tough, that's when bad leaders get exposed. And I actually kind of found that during COVID as well, that it really highlighted bad leaders and it showed good leaders really stood out. And I kind of see that as this story of like, well, we'll see if they can stand on their 2 feet, and this is going to really expose who it is. So what's your advice then to a leader? I'm not going to call them a bad leader, but let's say that they may have been riding the wave of good times, or they may just happen to have a big budget that kind of hides their lack of ability, or they've just got an incredible team that are kind of, compensating for their lack of ability to lead. What's the best way, if you identify that that's who you are, you're feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome and stuff, like, what can you do to improve yourself to be ready for those desperate times when they come?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is to be honest with yourself. So you need to be honest with yourself about the degree of reliance that you place on other people. Yeah. And I think, generally speaking, except in times of war or natural disaster, most leaders, certainly good leaders, will actually have built up a team, and that team will especially make up for any deficiencies that they have themselves. And so you need to acknowledge that, because I think that gives you a certain security, believe it or not, to know that you are relying on other people to make up for deficiencies or gaps, or to even improve the capacities that you have. And if you do acknowledge these yourselves, then when times get tough, you will have a tendency to go and seek their help rather than rely on your own resources to get yourself out of whatever particular sticky situation it happens to be.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. So I suppose we can, the lesson we can learn from this is just be warned that in desperate times, you may not, let me start again, because I don't want to say like you're a bad leader, but our faults or our where we lack as leaders will be exposed during desperate times. So let's make sure, like as Dr. Rod said, let's be honest with ourselves. Let's make sure that we're working on those things before we reach desperate times. So when we do reach desperate times, then we won't be exposed, or our failures won't be exposed because we've already compensated for them before. So hey, hopefully these guys will do well. Hopefully this will be able to cover for them. Maybe it'll branch out and move away from this late night television that's kind of falling apart at the moment, but maybe it's going to expose these guys for who they are as actors, not as comedians. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube with Leadership podcast. If you've liked that, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any thoughts of how it challenged or helped your leadership, put a comment below. And we'd be honored if you would consider subscribing for more leadership content. Also, make sure you check out the playlist for more episodes like this.